The Way of the Hero. To be a hero means being the author of your own myth. The first insight is the way of the hero because when you follow its four practices, you turn your wounds into a source of power. While you have certainly been emotionally hurt in some way, as we all have, when you walk the way of the hero, the traumas you have experienced can actually help you find your strength and compassion. You can accomplish this by shedding the stories of your past, just as a snake sheds her skin. In the process, you will cease being a victim of what happened to you and instead become empowered to write your own valiant tale of strength, healing, and beauty. You no longer have to be the misunderstood artist, the tough rebel with the heart of gold, the innocent who's been betrayed, or the child of the abusive parent. The first insight shows you that these are merely characters you've created to explain what happened to you. Your personal stories are just yarns you've spun. They are not you. Suffering occurs when you believe them to be true. Whether you created these stories yourself or someone else did it for you, you confuse them for reality. The characters in your narrative then become like hungry ghosts who show up at the dinner table and feed off your scraps. You may strive to understand and negotiate with these ghosts because you believe that they're genuine. But their complaints, demands, and thirst for attention are endless. The shadow of your father hovers over you, seeking forgiveness or retribution. The image of your children tells you that you should have raised them differently. And the specter of your youth haunts you, berating you for having squandered it. You are bombarded by the shrill voices of all those you've wronged or been wronged by, and they never shut up. In fact, if we feed these hungry ghosts, they will suck the life force right out of us. After all, how many people in their 50s do you know who are still struggling with the memory of a neurotic mother or a distant father? We can pat ourselves on the back for surviving a difficult childhood, or we can rationalize our behavior patterns by pointing to the racism or gender discrimination we suffered, the way our parents neglected us, or to any number of logical reasons for why we act the way we do. As long as we cling to the belief that these stories are real, we stay stuck, continually feeding the hungry ghosts in a dreary process that mimics, yet forestalls, true healing. Too often we work overtime to meet the requirements of our story. How many family rituals continue because everyone is convinced that they have to perform them in order to express their love and loyalty to their parents, children, and siblings? How many people spend their lives in meetings that have little practical purpose except to perpetuate the idea that productive individuals attend lots of important meetings? How many students force themselves to choose practical courses of study rather than following their heart's interest? When you banish the ghosts from your table and let go of your stories about what is proper, appropriate, and best, you free yourself to explore the mystery of who you and the other people in your life truly are. The first insight is associated with serpent, the physical body, the material world, and sensory perception. And as you master it, you'll start to see beyond the most simplistic literal level of reality. You'll begin to recognize the events from your early life that shaped and molded you, as well as how your parents and culture affected who you've become. And then, when you outlive that story, you can craft a new one that's better suited to a hero's journey. You can let go of the tedious tale of a middle-aged man reliving his adolescence, or a woman in her 40s trying to look and act as if she were in her 20s, and write a far more original story for yourself. You will recognize the divine choreography of events in your past that have propelled you on your journey of healing, learning, and discovery. The physical manifestations of our stories. Our stories are so powerful and convincing that they get internalized and become lodged in our muscle tissue as cellular memories. So when we somatize these tales, the way we walk and talk changes. We might forget that we're poets and not just parents, and find ourselves speaking in baby talk. We may convince ourselves that we are perpetual victims, and instead of striding confidently, shuffle along with eyes cast downward and shoulders hunched. Actors who want to truly inhabit a role will often start by carefully observing the physical characteristics and movements of an angry young man, a depressed middle-aged woman, or a wide-eyed innocent. They understand that these people's stories manifest in their physical appearance and movement. Whatever your image of who you are in your story, you will embody it, and people will respond to you as such. The way you look and act will send the message that you're unapproachable or friendly, confident or insecure, powerful or wounded. Also, whether you realize it or not, you'll beam at others who are supposed to be in your circle, and shun those whose body language or looks signal that they don't belong in your world, because you're buying into their stories. Think about the people you sit down next to on a crowded bus. They're probably the ones who are most likely to be in your social circle, rather than those who look, dress, and act unlike you. I'm reminded of when I spent a summer in a seedy part of New York City several years ago. The first few days, I observed that the street was full of muggers and rapists, yet, over the ensuing weeks, I discovered that these sinister characters were just my neighbors. And they were the nicest people. They had simply adopted a look that ensures that you command respect in New York City. Soon after this realization, I saw a menacing character reflected in a shop window and became frightened. That's when I understood that I too had developed an attitude and a look that demanded respect in the streets, and I barely recognized my own self. Why we cling to our stories. We cling to our tales because we derive some benefit from them, even when they also cause us suffering. Usually, the main payoff is that our ego is able to be a star if we remain part of the drama. We believe that someday we'll overcome our terrible childhood or disaster-prone love life if we work hard enough at fixing ourselves. But we don't consider letting go of the role of victim. Doing so would require us to release the ego's need to be in charge of telling the story. Your ego has a very strong survival instinct and will do just about anything to stay alive. It will fight the longing to heal and insist on its need to be right. You may have experienced this when you were arguing with someone. There was a part of you that wanted to stop jousting and instead find common ground with him or her, but your ego insisted that you knew more or had the superior point of view, so it demanded that you keep fighting until the other person was vanquished. Your ego has convinced you that if you let go of your story, you won't be loved, valued, recognized, or seen. You might even disappear. Often, the benefit of clinging to our stories is that they give us a false sense of security and purpose. After all, who are we if we're not the wise authority figure, the creative rebel, or the nurturing parent? In my early days, when I practiced psychology, I would hear people talk about their life stories, claiming their right to feel victimized by their childhoods, spouses, or finances. Inevitably, they got sick of these unoriginal yarns that only served to trap them in their suffering. Yet they knew no other way. They found themselves repeating the same drama over and over again, with different jobs, partners, and friends. Sometimes they would leave therapy when I explained that they weren't the only ones bored to exhaustion with their tales. In those days, I was young and didn't know how to assist my clients in forging a new story. a heroic myth that would be empowering instead of deadening. In actuality, our story becomes a death sentence for the hero within, because it demands denying what doesn't fit into its narrowly defined roles. I have children, for instance, but I am not a quote-unquote father. Of course, I do fathering, and I believe that I do it well, but that doesn't define who I am. I also do writing and healing, but I'm not a writer or a healer. Who I am is a mystery that I uncover more clues to every day. Some days I feel completely befuddled about who I am, but I don't let that get in the way of my doing good, effective parenting. It's just that I recognize that a character like father, writer, or healer is far too small to describe what I am. If you identify yourself as a parent, remember that your children will outgrow their need for a mother or a father who takes care of them. Who will you be when your children leave home? How will your role shift? Many parents become depressed when their last child moves away, as the empty nest syndrome forces them to face the fact that they are no longer needed to wash their child's clothes or make sure he eats 3 square meals a day. Similarly, if you identify yourself as an entrepreneur, a writer, a healer, a husband, or a wife, you'll come to the end of that role someday. You'll have to create a new identity for yourself at that point. And it can be frightening because you don't know if you will find an identity that has meaning for you. Every character in your story presents false evidence of your true nature. And when you insist on only seeing others, whether it's your mother, your father, your boss, or your child, in the role they play in your life story, your perception will keep you from experiencing who they really are. This will create anger in you and in them. However, when you let go of your story, your relationships with those who you love and struggle with will begin to heal, and the resentments will dissolve. Dropping our roles. Every story has a cast of leading characters who play certain roles. When we practice the way of the hero, we drop the limiting characters we identify with, along with the beliefs that these characters hold to be true. Our characters become what we do, but they are not what we are. We can continue to perform as a nurse, mother, son, salesperson, real estate agent, or retiree, and can be immensely effective at each of these tasks. We can be in the world but not possessed by that which is ultimately unimportant. In other words, we are not the laundry, the cooking, or the cleaning. We simply do these things without pain or struggle. I was always puzzled by that section in the Bible where Christ asks, "Who is my mother?" Then I understood he was setting himself free of the role of Son of Mary, with all the issues that accompany being a good Jewish son, to take on his greater role of Son of God. You see, each role we play is a bundle of beliefs and a bag full of expectations, and when those beliefs and expectations aren't met by others in the world, we're disappointed and take it personally. When we let go of our roles, we can do what we're called to do. We no longer take the world personally or need to make sure that our ego gets attention and validation. Shedding our ancestral and karmic stories. When you walk the way of the hero, you cast off the narrative you've inherited, which can go back thousands of years. Your story isn't new. It's a replay of what happened to you in your childhood, which is a retelling of the same plot you've played out over the course of many lifetimes. It's the same tale that drew you to the family you were born into, because it dovetailed so well with theirs. It's also the saga you inherited from your mother and father, the one they were unable to heal. You inherit these wounds from your parents and then pass them on to your children. in the hopes that they'll heal them for you. In the Amazon, they call these ancestral curses. If you want to get rid of your historical baggage, it's important to honor your ancestors. If you don't, they'll continue living through you and haunting every endeavor and relationship in your life. But if you respect and celebrate them, no matter how awful their legacy, you can move on, and so can they. You change your ancestral story and break the curse for them, your children, and your children's children. You won't feel hurt and angry as you remember that your father walked out on your family, or cling to your old story of how that's the reason you feel you can't trust romantic partners. Karma runs in families. A cold mother raises a child who becomes a smothering mom, who raises a daughter who, as a result of being smothered, doesn't even want children. As each generation attempts to work through the legacy of the family trauma, someone has to make a conscious decision to rewrite the story. In my family, for instance, my grandfather lost all his money in the Depression when he was 49. My father lost his position, his home, and his career, and had to flee Cuba during the Communist Revolution when he was 48. When my brother was 49, he lost his life. When I was 48, the so-called family curse, the karma that my father and grandfather had suffered from, struck me. I went through a very difficult time during which my spouse and I separated, and she took our children to live in another state. I lost my home and my family. I was reliving the fate of my father and his father before him. Then one day, while hiking alone in the Andes, I was startled by a familiar whisper. I believed I heard my father's voice telling me, "Until you realize why you were born, my son, you will continue living my life." This launched me into a 2-year exploration of my family's history, where I discovered this pattern of catastrophic loss. Then I went back to my father's message and understood that I'd made a punctuation error. What he was trying to tell me was, "Until you realize why you were born, my son, you will continue living my life." I was then able to thank him for his wise counsel and no longer hold him responsible for my fate. My task was to realize what I came to learn in this life. In the process, I became the author of my own story. I no longer had to unknowingly live my father's life all over again and continue making the same mistakes he and his father had made. Moreover, my own son had been freed from the family curse altogether. When we rewrite our story, we elevate our ancestors from the gutter, no longer holding them responsible for our lives, and we break the negative legacies they've handed down to us. We let go of stories such as, "I'm a neurotic mess because my mother was completely crazy," or "I'm angry and misunderstood, just like my father and his father before him." We're no longer victims of the folly of our ancestors. Instead, we can honor them and thank them for their gifts, no matter how painful it was to receive them. Exercise. Building your ancestral altar. Most anthropologists still believe that the ancestral altars found in every traditional culture are used for worship. The truth is that these societies understand that when you celebrate your ancestors, no matter how terribly they might have behaved, you find forgiveness and compassion and can break free of their karma and stories. The Laika say that if you don't honor the ancestors with an altar you build for them, they will run amok in your house. That is, it's better to know where they are than to ignore their legacy, kick them into the psychological gutter, and cling to the story of being a victim of their actions. The following exercise can spare you from spending years in psychotherapy, working through your mother and father issues. Find a spot in your home, such as a shelf, windowsill, or fireplace mantel where you can make a small altar and then place a cloth on it. Next, arrange photographs or symbols of your ancestors on top. For example, if you don't have a picture of your great-grandfather, you might put his ring or some other object he owned on the altar. You can also use slips of paper with your ancestors' names, or photographs of homes where your parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents were raised. I have a friend who created an altar with a runner her great-grandmother embroidered, on which she set a photograph of her grandmother, who was always her inspiration. She also wanted to recognize and honor the ancestors who taught her lessons that caused her pain, but it was very difficult for her to gaze at photographs of them. So she discovered that it was easier to honor them when she placed on her altar photographs of them taken when they were children. Seeing her family members in their youth reminded her of the goodness within them, which had not always been so obvious to her when they were adults. To honor your ancestors, place fresh flowers in a vase on your altar, or light incense. You may also want to bring your family members offerings from nature as the seasons change, such as shells or stones you pick up from the beach in summer, pine cones and dried leaves in the fall, and so on. Every time you change the offerings, thank your ancestors for the gifts they gave you, no matter how harsh it was for you to experience receiving them, or how difficult it was to perceive them as gifts at all. Remember that history is not what actually happened, but how you choose to remember it. That is, how it lives within you. Working with this ancestral altar, you can change your family's story at the mythic level, where tales are epic journeys, not the same old tired sagas of emotional or material success or failure. Make a habit of stopping at your altar to reflect upon the gifts of your ancestors. Remember that you've chosen to rewrite your story, and in your revised version, your family members are not villains and you're not a victim. Keep in mind, too, that this altar must be a representation of the one you build inside of you. That is, what you create in your home should serve as a sort of spiritual post-it note, reminding you to feel gratitude for the legacy you've been given and the lessons your ancestors taught you.